now let's have a look at essay construction. What makes a band 6 essay, right? Because that is, at the end of the day, our goals. Your goal may be, for example, to get a band 5 essay or a band 4 essay, to improve even generally. So whatever your goal is, really the best way to achieve it is to smash your Module A essays. Sorry, I just literally hit my computer so hard. So to smash your Module A essays. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there are three main components for it. We've got clear structure. So we really want to make sure that the way in which our essay sort of proceeds, it's clear, it's concise, and makes sense. And most importantly, the ideas built upon one another. You don't want to repeat the same idea in 10 different ways. You don't want to, constantly tell me, ultimately, for example, readers are able to see this, or readers are able, just the one thing, tell that to me 10 different ways. That doesn't cut it. There is a lot to go through. There is a lot of meat in your textual study. There's a lot to sort of deconstruct. So I really want to make sure that every time that you're introducing an idea under a theme, for example, if you've got the theme of power, for let's say Richard III and looking for Richard, every time you're telling me something different about the power, you're building upon that key idea of, okay, this is how power is seen in the text, but then we see the way in which Shakespeare really talks about the power in terms of determinism. However, that is contrasted by Pacino, who talks about more so who frames power in more so a democratic sense, which adheres to his 20th century context. Things like that, where you're taking a one big idea and really deep diving into these sort of smaller ideas that constitute that big idea. So that's clear structure. Original analysis, that obviously comes through by really engaging with your text and finding quotes and finding evidence that really brings your point to light. And finally, personal voice. So clear structure. I would say that the best structure to use in Module A is an integrated structure. Obviously, I know so many people who use the text-by-text structure, or sometimes schools necessitate you, for example in assessment tasks, to use a text-by-text structure, so you may feel more confident with that. Look, either way works, but I personally believe that an integrated structure really helps you to nail that comparison, to really make sure that throughout essay, your essay is sustained with that one core thesis, and you are really bringing that comparison out every time. That can be a bit hard with discussing that. Having that comparison aspect of it can be a bit hard with the text-by-text structure, especially because most of your comparisons concentrated in that second adapted paragraph's body paragraph, right? So that can be a bit hard sometimes, but I would say that an integrated structure is a really good way to go about it. And the way it's structured is you want to base a paragraph on themes. So you want to have 3 big paragraphs. So with theme 1, you want to discuss both text. Theme 2, same thing. Theme 3, same thing. But each time, you're actually giving me, it's easy because you're going one for one. Text 1 says this, text 2 says that. This is what I sort of get away as a result of this study, and you can sort of do the same thing, and that's a bit easier than that text-by-text structure, but whatever works best for you. A sample essay structure. So for example, we've got 3 texts here. So we've got Tempest Taxied, 4 texts: Tempest Taxied, Mrs. Dalloway, The Hours, Ariel, Birthday Letter, so Platt and Hughes, and Richard III, Looking for Richard. So this is where, to give you an example of how you can go about structuring your themes. But as you will notice that the 3rd paragraph each time is language. And the reason that I would recommend doing something like that, to have language as your 3rd paragraph, is to really comment on how is language shaping this discourse, how's language playing a huge role in this appropriation, and what is the power of language. And that is a really nice sort of self-reflexive way to show the marker that you are engaging with with the way in which change is being manifested, and that's through language. So so let's start off now looking at the structure, a clear structure. How do we actually have a clear structure? So we've got an intro. Firstly, a good intro provides a clear thesis as a response to the question in the first sentence. Please try not to repeat the question. Try not to use, repeat the keywords word for word in the question. You really want to frame it, basically. You want to frame it, and you want your explanation of thesis to be 2 to 3 sentences max. Otherwise, it can get very clunky. It can be a bit hard to sort of, read through. So just make sure it is elaborating on the question. It is, framing the question in light of your text, and it's elaborating on the question. It's not just repeating what the question or the keywords are. If it's a quote, I don't want you to just say, if the quote says text can, for example, a very simple example. If the quote says, text can evolve with time, or values evolve with time. In your thesis, you don't want to say, textual conversations allow us to look at how texts evolve with time. That is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But that is a very simple way of putting the thesis. What you want to say, you want to frame it more. You want to frame it in light of your text, and you want to add on to it and elaborate it. So you want to say, through the textual conversation between these two texts, it is evident the way in which societal values evolve and transcend time in order to have this effect, and this can be seen in the evolution of these two values, which ultimately, or something like that, where you're adding on to it, you're telling me a bit more, and so may end with ultimately this tells us that language inherently remains the same to humans. The meaning might change, but the core of language and the core of these ideas remain the same. So it's very important to really add on to that. So explanation of the thesis, again, no more than 2 to 3 sentences. Introduce your text as an example of your thesis in action. That is what you want to do. This is evident in these texts, or you want to introduce it within the thesis. Key contextual so introduce your text. Now, sometimes, because we're so used to like calling the author a certain name. So like for Shakespeare, you don't say William Shakespeare, you just say Shakespeare. For Donne and Wit, you just say Donne, right? You don't say John Donne. So that habit I've seen sometimes being carried through to essays, where in essays I would say, this is evident in Shakespeare's text and Puccini's text. You need to give me full name. So full name of the composer, the year that it was published, form, and key contextual features, like only the most important ones. Like for example, for Keats, you may want to talk about, for Keats, you want to talk about the Romantic periods, like mention those key contextual features. For Platt and Hughes, you definitely want to comment on the personal relationship that is, underpinning the whole study of the two texts. Signpost paragraphs, quite important, and provide synthesis statement with audience impact. Too often, again, I've seen, in essays at the end where you don't quite put it all together and give me an audience impact and link it back to the textual conversations and lead it into the essay. I know it's a lot, like that's like 4 different things to do in one sentence, but you really want to aim for that. And once you nail that structure for that last sentence, which is, your synthesis statement with audience impact, would link back to textual conversations and leading the reader into essay, you can easily adapt that sentence like every time. You wouldn't have to change it every time. It'd be a bit easy to adapt. So let's have a look at this sample intro now. So the connection between text create an ongoing cultural conversation that gives insight into truth. In your response, discuss how your pair of prescribed texts engage in this conversation to shape audience's perspective. So now what we want to do is let's have a read through this. So through a comparative study, audiences may dissect the dissonant perspectives onto themes that connect texts in an ever-evolving cultural conversation. So you can see we're not repeating the question. We're not saying that ultimately texts create an ongoing cultural conversation. What we're doing is we're adding on to that, and we're framing that in light of the text. So through comparative study, audiences may dissect the dissonant perspectives on themes that connect text in an ever-evolving cultural conversation. In turn, they excavate differing truths, which complicates the apparent universality of such themes. Such a notion is reflected in Sylvia Plath's striking collection of poetry, Ariel 1965. So that's a clear statement first right there. Then we've got a text, so Ariel 1965, which finds universal truths about identity, gender, and language appended by Cold War anxieties and the advent of postmodernism. Yet, Ted Hughes' poetic collection Birthday Letters 1998. So both my texts are there. I have introduced them. I have defined what the form is. So you really want to aim for to have this key context or form terms when you introduce your text. So like if you are introducing, for example, Richard III, for Shakespeare, I might say, and Shakespeare's Elizabethan drama or Elizabethan tragic drama or something like that, where I'm making sure, tragic drama. So with that, I want to try my very best to include the keywords. So that's the introduction of the text. We then have the paragraphs. So you are telling me what your main ideas are. So identity, gender, and language. I know like sometimes you can elaborate on them, but because there's so much to sort of mention in a modern intro with both texts, and definitely try and prioritize your form and context key ideas first, I would say just mentioning like one word themes should be fine. But if you are in a habit of expanding on them, please don't expand too much. Just aim for like one line at the very most. That should be like maximum. So introducing the text, and let me just go back so I can read the next slide. So yeah, Ted Hughes' poetic collection Birthday Letters 1998 source doubt in this narrative, reauthoring it through the personal lens of the couple's marriage, there's the context, and in turn asserting conflicting perspectives about the same truths. Thus, through an examination of intertextuality, audiences may observe the multiplicity of ideas that spring from universal themes and in turn reject the possibility of absolute truths. And that is my audience impact. What am I gaining from this? So that's that. Now, let's just quickly think about thesis, right? So your thesis is made of two main elements. Your response to the question, which you will formulate on the day that you're given the question, and your personal thesis. So, you can, in a general essay, have an awesome thesis ready to go, your master key essay that you're going to adapt every time, but that can be very hard if you just sort of go off that one essay and you don't really practice that adaptation. That practicing is so important. So, and every time, the big idea when you come about adapting your essay to different questions, because let's be real, we have to do that, right? It's about responding to the question and including your personal thesis. Your personal thesis can be prepared outside the exam room, and that is basically responding to what the module focus says, to textual conversations, and for each text, the personal thesis may be different. So for Richard, it may be more so about how the two texts are shaping the conversation about power. While with Dunn and Witt, I may say that the personal thesis is about this notion of mortality, and this grasp of life, for example. So really important that we can go ahead with that personal thesis being prepared, but the response to the question comes on the day, and then it is a matter of like conjoining the two and having your thesis ready to go. So definitely practice a lot with that. I personally didn't do like a master essay kind of thing. I would just sort of go ahead and have my quotes and ideas ready to go, and then each time adapt that to a different question. But I know for a lot of people, having a master essay ready to go works really well. So if that's your case, definitely make sure that you are prioritizing this adaptation to different questions. So ideas for a personal thesis, like I said, they will depend and they're derived from the study of your text, and they are specific to what you learn from the text. So each text you learn something different. So consider, for example, things like, why do composers appropriate text, what is the value of a comparative study, and also note that the questions generally can be often very similar. So do ideas transcend time, or are they bound up in context? Questions like that, where it's a matter of now applying your personal thesis to the question. So some other ideas here for your personal thesis, like showcasing the power of language to reshape context, critiquing the canonical status of text, or highlighting how themes transcend time. So those are some ideas there, but again, they will depend quite highly on your study of the two texts. So let's have a look now at the key points when it comes to your body paragraph. Aim for an integrated structure, just because all that I've said so far can be so helpful for a comparative essay, and like that, that comparison element can be easily achieved through an integrated structure. Make sure that you're balancing the discussion of the text and not getting too carried away with one text over the other. And finally, be comparative. Like, it is all about the textual conversation. So, using words like similarly, this mirrors, likewise. Those sort of connective words can really show the marker, firstly, which text you're talking about, give them direction, and show them that you're really looking at the text in light of one another, and you're drawing out those distinctions between the text. Okay, so here I've got a structure for you. So for a body paragraph, so paragraph 1, start off with your child text. So quote 1 is child text, quote 2 is parent text, quote 3 is child text, and then you reverse that. You can reverse that in the second paragraph, or you can keep it the same, but generally you want to reverse that in the second paragraph. So basically, I've got a checklist here for you. You don't have to follow it, obviously, word by word, but this is to sort of have this checklist in your mind that every time that you are writing. So, again, start off with the topic sentence. It should introduce the main idea of the paragraph and also link back to the question. You also, very important, you want to go into the analysis. So don't waste too much time on introducing the concept, the context beforehand, or talking a lot about context and form in those first 3, 4, 5 sentences. You want to get straight into the analysis and then incorporate context and form in your analysis. So ideally by 3, 4 is the max. I wouldn't go that far. I would say 2 sentences for your thesis explanation. Third one, dive deep straight into analysis. So go straight into your analysis, and generally by third sentence or fourth max, you want to be getting into your analysis. You want to be introducing the idea and then going straight into your analysis. I reckon really the big sort of the key for me when it comes to analysis that really worked well for me was QTEL. There are different ways in which you can sort of name it, whatever works, but for me it really helps sort of keep a clear structure in my head as I was writing. So QTEL stands for quote, technique, evidence, link. It just always really helped me be very clear. So quote can obviously be any evidence too, like if it's a film or something, but you want to aim for evidence, technique, effect, and link back to the question, link back to your main idea of your paragraph. You can sort of alternate each time. You want to aim for 2 quotes per text. You can go for 3 quotes where each text it's in that structure that we just went through, you alternate between 2 quotes for parent text, 1 for child. You can do that, but I would generally say having 2 quotes that are going back and forth can be really helpful. So altogether, you're aiming for 4 quotes in a paragraph. That is a lot. So if you want to aim for 3, that is okay too, but I would say that 4 is ideal. Next, integrating context and values into your effect. So rather than spending a lot of time in going through context at the beginning, this is what the context is, applying setting at the beginning, that can take away from your analysis, obviously, in terms of time, and me knowing the context on its own is not going to be as helpful or as a marker or as important as seeing the context being tied in to your analysis. So try and bring it out in your analysis, and this can be done by to concisely bringing contextual links without harping on about them for too long. So if you're telling me that Shakespeare's written this in the Elizabethan era, I don't want to sit there and read like 4 sentences, 3 sentences, or even 2 sentences on Elizabethan era, what it included. I want to see how the values of Elizabethan era were reflected in the text, which you can show me through your analysis, and then link back to your question. Have form-related evidence, that is really important. You want to include form-related evidence because that forms a huge part of the appropriation. Form is the key behind the appropriation. So definitely make sure that you've got form-related evidence. If you're doing a play, you want to have, for example, stage directions and stuff. If it's poetry, have enjambment, like form-related evidence, any techniques. Also, succinctly at the end of your paragraph, summarize your main point, include audience impact, and link back to Module A. Finally, what did I take away about this theme from my comparative study of the two texts? That is what your your last line of the paragraph is trying to tell me. What was the big idea that I took away in light of textual conversations? So your analysis should aim to flow something like this. First, I wrote text A, and I thought this. Then I wrote text B, and I changed my opinion. Going back to text A, I can now reconsider its ideas with my new opinion. Bonus. At the end of this journey, I can now comment on, or I can now see why, the two texts, studying them together is valuable, and that is your thesis. Sometimes, like I have seen, for example, like common mistakes that I see in essays is when too often people get so fixated on the analysis or on the ideas of the separate text, they fail to tie back the whole thing back to Module A or textual conversation. So don't lose sight of that. The key idea is textual conversations, always. So let's have a look at this exemplar. Alright, so language has an inherently political dimension, given its unique capacity to remake dominant narratives that shape contextual values. That is my topic sentence. I'm talking about language, and I am presuming that in this case, my question will more than likely be something to do with how values have evolved over time, about context, and how we can see that change in values and how that is reflected in language. So Shakespeare's Richard, now this is a body paragraph, Shakespeare's Richard explicitly reshapes his identity in the eyes of others through skillful contortions of language. Thus, like the formal vice in iniquity, I moralize two meanings in one word. So that is my quote. I am introducing it. Can you see, like by the second sentence, I'm already in my analysis. I'm not wasting time on telling you the context beforehand or, talking about the form beforehand. I am going straight into my analysis because I will bring in my context and values now. Shakespeare's allusion to the medieval character of the vice mobilizes connotations of performativity that are uniquely constructed by language. Lady Anne affirms the duplicity of language in the hands of Richard, having grossly grown captive to his honeyed words. The juxtaposing inner images of honeyed and gross embodies the divide between appearance and reality that is constructed by language. So every time, every evidence, I'm linking back to language, as you can see. I'm not just saying that just, for example, I'm not stopping at that divides, that embodies the divide between appearance and reality. I'm saying, how does this link back to my main idea? Because this divide is done through language. So that is constructed by language, provoking audiences to question the political influence wielded by words. And that is by audience impact. You don't want to miss out on that. I won't say to have every sentence. You can see in this, we didn't have it every sentence, but every second analysis, third analysis, it's important to have it up. And you can change it every time. With the first one, link back to the question. With the second one, link back to audience impact. And that will make sure that your essay, doesn't become monotonous. So, where was I? Yeah, echoing this, Pacino mobilizes language to reshape the meta-narrative of Shakespeare's irrelevance and incomprehensibility by reconstructing it in a medium and language with which his 90s American audience is familiar. Talking about audience is important, especially if you adapt a text where you're now telling me, why has this text been appropriated for a specific audience? What are we gaining from it? As a result, his text is rampant with anti-intellectualism demonstrated through his voiceover, where he states his goal to communicate a Shakespeare that is about how we feel. While Pacino feigns the inclusion of his audience in this docudrama through the collective pronoun, he jarringly deploys populist rhetoric in order to prioritize feeling over analysis that aligns with his own personal interpretation of Shakespeare. You can see how sophisticated this argument is in terms of like a metatextual approach. I'm now looking at how language is being manipulated by the composer to actually have power over the canonical text. Such a notion is heightened by the highly personal and inherently subjective docudrama form, where sustained voiceover and frenetic cuts in the style of cinema verite serve to mimic Pacino's internal monologue. This idea of this comment on form and how the form is being used to achieve a specific purpose, that is important. That is how you want to aim to include your form. You don't want to tell me, the docudrama does this. You're actually telling me what the docudrama is doing in light of the whole, study, in light of actually manifesting language. So consequently, audiences see how personal agenda permeates text and allows composers to reshape society through narrative. My audience impact. Returning to Shakespeare, so this is not telling me, okay, I went Shakespeare, Pacino, now back to Shakespeare. That sort of indication is important. As a marker or as a reader, this is helping me go along with the idea. So let's have a look. Returning to Shakespeare, we may reevaluate the relationship between composer and responder in negotiating political narratives. Indeed, Richard states in his opening soliloquy, "I am determined to prove a villain," where the use of past tense demonstrates how Richard's representation in the written and performed word are constrained by historical determination. If I had, let's say, spent 2 sentences talking about the contextual idea of determinism versus humanism in light of Elizabethan time, it would not have been as powerful as that 1 sentence is here in light of the quote, right? So I am determined to prove a villain, where the use of past tense, I'm linking the technique to the effect, demonstrates how Richard's representation in the written and performed word, because it is a drama, are constrained by historical determinism. Further, it insinuates the role of Shakespeare in propagating distorted historical narratives through the Globe Theatre in order to appease Queen Elizabeth and affirm the Tudor myth. This, and if you're studying Richard III, by now you would know that this is the key. I've talked about Pacino now. I've talked about my second composer sort of twisting the work around in order to have a specific meaning, or not twisting, but manipulating the work in order to sort of have power over the meaning. And now I'm comparing that with the initial text, which also does that. Shakespeare gives us a historically inaccurate narrative in order to appease Queen Elizabeth, whose grandfather was Henry VII, and in turn, through that, affirmed the Tudor myth. Thus, an examination of intertextuality unveils a new political dimension that exists between texts. And that idea itself is so prominent because, with any of the texts, there is a political dimension to it. There is a sense of, societal values and power being morphed through the text that exists between the text, that in turn provokes audiences to question the manifold ways language is manipulated to create power structures that govern our lives. And that last sentence easily summarizes everything and really nails the audience impact. That is what you kind of want to do. You want that body paragraph to be a conversation in itself. We're going back and forth. Shakespeare did this, Pacino did this, Shakespeare did this again. This is basically what this is telling me about language. That both texts, written in 2 distinct time periods, are showing me that language is being used to have a political purpose regardless of time. And that's my key idea. Okay, so now finishing up with conclusion. So we want a conclusion to be short and sweet. It needs to succinctly reiterate your thesis, and it is necessary for a Band 6 essay. So that last sentence is to really highlight that if you are running low on time and you cannot write your full, 4-line conclusion or 3-line conclusion, aim to just write a single sentence. That they won't consider the whole essay a sustained response without without a conclusion. So even if you're running super on time, like you don't have the time, write a one sentence conclusion. Just write it down, right? Just because even if it's not the best thing you've ever written, as you can see in that meme over there, even if it's not the best thing you've written a conclusion that still make sure that you're playing in that category of a band 5 or band 6 essay. It's really important to keep that in mind. But yeah, obviously in an ideal world, we want to have an awesome little conclusion that summarizes everything, puts everything into perspective and tells the marker, hey, I smashed out my essay. This is the ideas I've talked about to answer this question you asked me. This is my opinion on it. And you can see that in my personal voice, and this is how I finish off. So that's my essay done. See you later, right? So you want to try and have that. But of course, if time, because time is a restraint, right? Let's be honest. 40 minutes to write an essay is hard. So we do want to still get a conclusion in there, even if it's a sentence lock, even if it's like, in conclusion, the textual the comparative study allows audiences to view this. Like one sentence, not the best conclusion you've ever written, but it's there, so you're still contending for that, band 6 category. So let's